Just about showtime, so let's get underway. Welcome to our Parsha with Rashi variation, uh, somewhat variation tonight, because Purim is on the doorstep and we have advertised Abarbanel on Purim. And that is my objective to fulfill that description. However, it's not easy to do because our friend for the year, Don Yitzchak Abravanel, wrote very extensively on Shmuel. That was his first full-length perush on Malachim, on Shoftim, on Yehoshua. He wrote on Nevi'im Achronim as well, the later prophets. Of course, he wrote on the Chumash. He also wrote a commentary on Mor Nevuchim. He also wrote a philosophical work called Rosh Amanah. He also wrote several books, a kind of trilogy on Mashiach and the redemption, as well as a number of other works. He did not write on Megillas Esther, however, to the best of my knowledge. And that made it a bit difficult for me to find material that would let's say, conform to our promise for tonight. But fear not, I do have several ideas which I'm eager to share with you. And so let's get to it. So it so happens, I don't know whether it's just inadvertent or perhaps because Parshas Tetzaveh is very frequently, in fact, most of the time, Parshas Tetzaveh is the parsha that we read in the days immediately before Purim. But Abravanel, in his beautiful, eloquent style, drawing on biblical allusions and terminology very extensively, on several occasions in the course of his commentary on Parshas Tetzaveh, he uses references to Megillas Esther, not in really a substantive way, just as I say, as a literary way, as a way of literary style or elegance or eloquence. But I have seized on one or two of those examples to use it as a kind of justification to cultivate or establish a link between the Purim story and our subject for today. Let me start with a pasuk that appears at the end of Megillas Esther, and it is for anyone familiar with the storyline, and of course we are very eager to get to the end, even though the story of Esther is very beloved, but especially when we read it at night, we are all hungry. And therefore, when we get to the end, there's a certain sense of exhilaration. So let me remind you that the book of Esther says towards the very end, Ki Mordechai HaYehudi, it says the very last passage, Ki Mordechai HaYehudi Mishneh LaMelech Achashverosh. Mordechai from the tribe of Yehuda was the viceroy to the king, like the second to the king, Achashverosh, v'gadol Yehudim, great among the Jews, v'ratzui l'rovechav, well regarded or favored by his multitude of his brethren, Doresh tov la'amo, seeking the welfare, the well-being of his nation, v'dover shalom chol zaro, and concern for the welfare of all of his posterity. It's a beautiful pasuk, and with that, the Megillas Esther comes to a close. What's quite well known, though, and if it's not well known to you yet, let me be the first to tell you, that this turn of phrase, Ratsui l'rovechav, favored or well regarded by most of his brethren, somehow can be seen, I don't want to be crude, but damning with faint praise. Because by saying that most of his brethren or his peers favored him, the implication is that it was not universal. He was not universal acclaim. And this is surprising because Mordechai was the hero, Esther was the heroine, and we would think they would both be highly esteemed by the Jewish people. And no doubt they were. But that turn of phrase, Ratzui l'rovechav, requires an explanation. Now, the ArtScroll people render it probably correctly, according to the Pshat. L'rov echav doesn't mean rov the majority, it means rov like rabim, the multitude of his brethren. But the Talmud does interpret it in a literal way. The majority of his peers, of his colleagues, favored him, regarded him favorably, but not all of them did. And that's what Rashi quotes. Rashi says, Pirshu
Very
mimenu
tight.
miktsas Sanhedrin. Some of the members of the Sanhedrin, of which Mordechai was a leading constituent, some of them distanced themselves from Mordechai because he turned to the service of the king. Rashi says, "Shenase karov lemalchus." He became part of the king's inner circle, like the pasuk says. He was the mishneh lemelech. He was like the viceroy to the king. No doubt his responsibilities in the palace took up all of his time, or at least the great majority of it, and he had less time for the study of Torah. And therefore, some of his colleagues on the Sanhedrin thought, you finished your saving of the Jewish people. Well done to you. Now it's time to go back to the base medrash. And therefore, because he went into politics and became a political force, no doubt for the betterment of the Jewish people, and I would add, I would be confident for the betterment of Persia as well. He wasn't looking to advance the benefit of the Jewish people to the detriment of the kingdom, I'm sure. But nevertheless, from the point of view of some of his colleagues, it was ill-advised for him to do that. There's a famous comment of Rashi based on the Gemara. It occurred to me that since the days of Mordechai until perhaps our own times, I don't know whether there has been another Jewish person of stature who has been as karov lamalchus as Don Yitzchak Abravanel. His most famous gig was as the finance minister, the minister of the treasury to Ferdinand and Isabella of the crowns of uh, Seville and Aragon. And he became the most influential, most highly placed Jewish figure, not just of his time, but perhaps of all time. I mean, there have been others, Moses Montefiore, but even Moses Montefiore was a kind of a freelance diplomat. Abravanel, he was before that in Portugal. He was very close to the king of Portugal as well. The problem is the king died, and he backed the wrong horse in the succession, and he had to flee for his life. In fact, they issued a warrant for his arrest. He was tipped off in advance, and he managed to escape to Spain. Of course, when the Jews were expelled from Spain, Abravanel, although he was offered an opportunity to remain, but he went into exile. He ended up after many tribulations, excuse me, in Naples and then in Venice, other places along the way as well. And in Venice, again, he became prominent and he was drawn into the service of the nobility and of the crown as well. And Abravanel was exceedingly gifted, not just educated and very clever, but he was a consummate diplomat and statesman. He was a very shrewd and reliable, you could say, businessman. Um, and the reason I'm dwelling on this is that I think that we can almost postulate that Abravanel may have been like alert to such a criticism of himself as well. But I'm not only speculating, because at the end of his life, Abravanel wrote, I regret that I spent so much of my time and energy, so many years of my life in the service of the kings, and I did not devote myself more fully to the service of the King of Kings. And although this is a very touching and very moving, like note of maybe self-reproach or self-deprecation, I would like to inform you that actually Abravanel, although it is true that he was in the service of kings throughout most of his adult life, whenever he had a chance, like when he went into exile, he turned to his writing right away. In fact, the first time when he fled from Portugal to Spain, that's when he began to write. He produced some of his most enduring literary, by which I mean Torah, output during those weeks and months when he was effectively he had escaped from the service of the King of Portugal, and in Spain he had some time on his hands, and he began to write. And we find repeatedly in his throughout his life, whenever he had time, whenever his circumstances, often because fortune turned against him, and he found himself, without obligations or opportunities, for that matter, in the gentry and in the nobility and among the courtiers, then he turned his attention to the most productive, most insightful, and often profound Torah study and Torah productivity in terms of his writings. So, first comment I want to say is that Mordechai became Mishnah Lemelech Achashverosh, and we could say about Abravanel nearly the same. He became Mishnah Lemelech, and just as Mordechai, I'm not aware of a tradition about Mordechai's own attitude towards his choice of remaining in the service of Achashverosh. Perhaps he had little, agency. Perhaps it was forced upon him. But certainly Abravanel did express some regret at the end of his life. But at the same time, of course, he was the leading figure, the leading lay leader of the Jewish people of Spain and in his generation. So we uh, certainly, can understand how Abravanel sought or chose to enter the service of the king. Besides which, he was in the family for generations, his father and his grandfather before him. Just like to add as one last comment that Abravanel was always saddened that unlike Mordechai, who succeeded in averting the tragedy for the Jews of Persia in the days of Haman, Abravanel himself was unsuccessful in his efforts to overturn the infamous Alhambra decree of March 1492, in which the Jews were expelled from Spain, driven from Spain on the 31st of July of 1492. The Alhambra decree was signed in March, and it was the deadline for the departure was the end of July. 1492. And although he endeavored greatly, and if we had the time, which we don't right now, we could discuss what he did and how he endeavored to seek to overturn the decree, but it was not to be. I want to share with you now a very interesting comment of Abravanel, and I would love, with your permission, and I suppose you don't have much opportunity to object on this Zoom sort of context, um, to share with you a thought of my own ruminations about hearing the Megillah. But let me begin by uh, taking you, if you've got your Chumash there, to Parshas Tetzaveh. In the Art Scroll, it's on page 470. And we're looking at chapter 28, verse 32, 33. So the Torah is describing the me'il. Me'il is a robe, a very I think it says turquoise wool. It was maybe like a cape that he wore over his shoulders, the Kohen Gadol, and he was open on the sides. But what's notable about this cape was the pomegranates and the bells. Actually, if you've got the Art Scroll Chumash on page 472, you can see an illustration of the decorative bells and pomegranates that were attached to the hem of the Kohen Gadol. But let's read those verses, psukim first. פסוק ל"ב, ויפי ראשו בסוחו שפה יהיה לפיו סביב מעשה אורג כפי סחרה יהיה לו לא יקרא. It's the next passage that we need, really. 33. ועשיסה על שולב רימוני תכלס וארגמן וסלס שני על שולב סביב. You shall make around its hem pomegranates of turquoise, purple, scarlet wool, and its hem all around. Ufa'amonei zahav besocham saviv, and gold bells between them all around. So Rashi's view is that the pomegranates and the bells were alternating. Pamon zahav rimon al shulei me'il saviv. Now you think to yourself, a garment that has these little bells attached to its hem, he's going to be tinkling everywhere he goes. Indeed. So the Torah says, "V'haya al Aharon l'shareis," and it shall be I mean, Aaron should wear it when he does the divine service. V'nishma kolo b'va'o el hakodesh lifnei Hashem, and the sound will be heard, will be audible when he enters the holy section of the Mishkan, and subsequently the high priests who are the descendants of Aaron in each generation, lifnei Hashem before God, would say so. And when he leaves, when he exits, v'lo yamus, and he won't die. From here we have the implication that if he doesn't wear the garment, or if he ditches the bells or something like that, so he comes and goes in quietude, then he may be liable to death at the hands of heaven. Abarbanel has an interesting suggestion on this. He says when the Torah tells us that the tinkling of the bells will ensure that he does not die as a result of entering the holy part of the Beis Hamikdash or of the Mishkan, so Abravanel suggests ve'efshar lomar shahaya hashmas kol hapa'amonim, that the purpose of the tinkling, the sound of the bells clanging, sheyedu mibachutz, so that the people, maybe that the Kohanim who are standing outside the holy section, that they will know ki kohen chai, they'll know he's still alive. Ki ilo hayames lo hayanishmaim, because if he had dropped dead, then he would be inert and the bells would have fallen silent. So he says when the Torah says that velo yamus v'nishma kolo b'vol hakrosh lifnei Hashem uvet seso, when he enters and when he leaves velo yamus, it can be understood to hint to the idea that it shows that he's alive and he's not dead. Why might he die? So Abravanel reminds us that during the days of the Second Temple, unfortunately, there were Kohanim, high priests, who were appointed by the king or by the authorities for reasons of graft, for reasons of political patronage, for reasons of prestige, rather than for reasons of worthiness. And those Kohanim, often they would die because they were not deserving. And it was in that sense a kind of dangerous job, but people put their lives at risk for glory and for honor and for prestige and for money all the time, and that's what happened. He says, "B'konei bayis sheni she'im ha'isa emunah ra'a b'libam." If these kohanim were undeserving, if they had a like impulse of heresy in their hearts, then they would not even survive. They would die when they entered the holy part of the Mikdash. And therefore, when people didn't hear outside, when they didn't hear the footsteps and the tinkling anymore, then they would know that the Becheto that he has died according to his sin. I think this is an interesting and a novel interpretation. By the way, on Shabbos, we're going to talk about body image and the Kohen Gadol, and we'll have another approach altogether to this subject. But for the purposes of our Purim shir tonight, I would like to just draw a line, and I would like to somehow, with with your permission, to suggest a drash. And here we have the idea that the tinkling of these bells alerts the listener to the fact that the Kohen is alive. If the tinkling stops, it means he's dropped dead. I just mention another point, though. Abravanel also says a further idea, because I want to do the Purim connection. He says that the Mukubalim, and it's interesting, he doesn't often, but on this occasion he does quote the Mukubalim. The Kabbalists say, it was a form of like getting permission to enter, just like a person rings the doorbell or he knocks on the door, so that he alerts the people inside that he's going to enter. He doesn't just barge in unannounced. Here's where an example of where Abravanel, just for reasons of eloquence, refers to a pasuk in Megillas Esther. Ki haba beheichal hamelach pitom mibli reshus. Someone who enters the chamber of the king suddenly without permission, chayav misa, he's liable to death. As we read about Achashverosh, shikanes bechatzer hapnimi, someone who enters the inner courtyard of the palace, mibli kriya, without having been summoned, achas daso lahamis. And that turn of phrase, as I'm sure you know, comes from the book of Esther, where Esther pushes back against Mordechai's urging, and she says, "How can I go to the king unannounced? It's well known that someone who rocks up unbidden, he's a goner unless the king, in a moment of clemency or a moment of compassion, favors the arrival of that person. But I'm taking my life in my hands." So that's what Abravanel says here as well. And quoting the Kualim Rabbeinu Bachaya speaks about it. It's like a way of alerting the malachim that they should clear out because the Kohen Gadol is arriving. But if he were to turn up without, so to speak, alerting them, then he might be seen as an intruder in a realm to which he does not deserve access. So that's what Abravanel says about the further interpretation to those bells. But I want to go back to the first comment. If you don't hear the noise, it means that the Kohen has expired. When I read that, I was reminded of a beautiful, very compelling passage in the 19 letters of Rav Hirsch. Again, you've probably heard of it. If not, let me be the first to tell you. Rav Shamshon Hirsch, as a young man in his, I think, early 30s, maybe late 20s even, I think late 20s, he wrote a book called The 19 Letters of Ben Uziel. He published it in German, which was itself a kind of earthquake in rabbinic writing, because other rabbis, even if they wrote in German, they wrote with Hebrew letters. It was a kind of sort of hybrid between Yiddish and German. He wrote in a pure German, and he wrote a what we would call a sefer, a Hebrew book, not just a Hebrew book, but a holy, it wasn't a Hebrew book, it was a German book, but it was a holy book. And he wrote it not to preach to the converted, as we would say, but rather as an outreach endeavor. And he published it, therefore, in a language that was respected by the sophisticated uh, Jews of Reform inclination. It's a fascinating book. You can read the original translation into English. You can read the subsequent translation into English. Probably the original may be a bit better, but in any case, I think it's in the 17th letter. It's one of the last letters where he writes about the upheavals in his time in mid 19th century Germany, the upheavals in terms of the rise of reform and the stampede away from traditional Judaism. He said, he writes, we're living in times of turmoil, times of great like crisis. He said, but I would prefer the home in which we hear the screams of agony of a woman in travail to the silence that prevails in the home of a woman without children. He says the ferment that we have in the Jewish world today, he says, at least it suggests there's an energy there. There's a kind of quest for something new and something exciting and something compelling. You could say he was trying to put a favorable spin on things, but I'll leave it for you to judge. You can read it's not a long book, actually. I'll leave it for you to judge. And I've often thought of that when it comes to reading the Megillah. The Mishnah Berurah and the good books say that there's a mitzvah to bring children to hear the Megillah because a child who's old enough to understand the storyline, there's a mitzvah of chinuch. But children who are quite young, you should be cautious about bringing them because they don't understand, they don't follow the storyline, and they don't behave. Not only that, but it has become the minhag already for hundreds of years to protest vocally or to seek to drown out the name of Haman every time it appears. And the word Haman, the name Haman, appears many times in the Megillah, and the children and the adults as well can create a raucous and a din. And the Mishnah Berurah is quite down on him. Not only that, but the Baal Kriya has to be conscious of the possibility that people won't be able to hear him if he's carrying on with the reading at the time when the children and the adults, again, are making a lot of noise. And it's not for me to, strike a kind of contrary note to what the Mishnah Berurah and the good books say. I'm just observing that there, I think, is a profound wisdom in the collective intuition of the Jewish people in encouraging children to come to hear the Megillah and giving them the opportunity, you could say, to let off steam and to, you know, carry on and to get excited and to, use the groggers and the noisemakers in order to, engage with great enthusiasm in the moment, because that kind of energy, that kind of enthusiasm, that kind of excitement, and even if the children are too young, or maybe those who are not that young and maybe should know better, even if they get a bit carried away, but there's a vitality there. I think, at least that's not what Abravanel has in mind, but it evokes to me the similar idea that, it's not the norm for any person to have bells on his clothing so he tinkles everywhere he goes. And that's when the Meforshim have a lot to say about why that was the practice that the Torah prescribes. It's not just a rabbinic tradition or a minhag, Ashkenazim or Sephardim. It's explicit in the Torah right here. And it says, V'lo yamus, it's something very important. But Abravanel says maybe part of the reason is to prove that he hasn't died. When there is noise, there is life. When there is silence, it's not always a sign of promise and a sign of achievement. So to me, this is evocative of the balance between, of course, our responsibility, our duty to hear the words of the Megillah, but at the same time, let's not stamp out the enthusiasm and the excitement of the children, the younger children, even the older children, and even the adults for that matter. There is a place for it, and I think that certainly. To my mind, this minhag, a well-entrenched minhag, is a reflection of that as well. I want to just end with a thought that is from a friend of mine from a few years ago, Ksav Sofer. I was actually giving these shurim on Thursday nights from the Ksav Sofer as well. I did mention this thought on one occasion, so what I want to end with right now does not come from Abravanel. I try to think, can I convince myself that this is the sort of drash that Abravanel might have said if he had written on Megillas Esther? I don't know. Perhaps we can always speculate what he didn't write. He could have written almost anything. We have been learning together, Abravanel. We've gotten a bit of understanding for his style. Perhaps he could have said this. But anyway, I found this thought in the writings of the Ksav Sofer. He refers to the well-known medrash that Rabbi Akiva was once giving a lecture and his listeners were nodding off. They were not as attentive as they could have been. He saw they were falling asleep in some cases. And he sought to excite them or to arouse them and to sort of pique their curiosity and to get them thinking and engaged. And he said that's how the Medrash introduces the comment. It's interesting. But he says that in the book of Esther, we read the beginning of the book of Esther, we read that Achashverosh ruled over 127 provinces. And it's interesting that that number 127 appears somewhere else in the scripture, in Tanakh, and of course that refers to the life of Sarah. Sarah lived for 127 years. So Rabbi Akiva suggested, or not just suggested, but he asserted that the 127 provinces over which Esther ruled as the queen of Persia was in the merit of the 127 years that Sarah, her great-great-grandmother, a few more greats, lived. So Sarah lived for 127 years, and her descendant Esther ruled over an empire spanning 127 provinces. This is the well-known medrash. So much has been written about the curiosity of the identity of these 127 years, and Ksav Sofer suggests the following. So he starts by quoting his father, Chassam Sofer, even more famous, who says that Yaakov was amazed and delighted to learn that his son Joseph, whom he had given up for dead years before, was alive. And listen to what the Torah says, what the sons of Yaakov, what the sons of Yaakov told their father when they came back from Egypt after Joseph had revealed himself. They said to him, Od Yosef Chai, v'chi hu moshel b'chol Eretz Mitzrayim, and he rules over all of Egypt. So Yaakov was not just delighted, actually, he was astonished. In fact, he didn't believe them at first. Chassam Sofer says, V'chi hu moshel b'chol Eretz Yisrael. Yosef ruled over Egypt. Egypt did not rule over him. Yaakov was understood what his sons told him to mean, that the culture of idolatry, depravity, and debauchery of Egypt had not corrupted Yosef. Because once he heard that Yosef was alive and he's in Egypt, Yaakov inevitably would have thought, what is left of him after all of those years in Egypt? So when they told him that Egypt had not corrupted him. So Kasav Sofer says, based on that thought, maybe Esther ruled over 127 provinces of the Persian Empire, and she did not succumb to the lure of the prurience, licentiousness, and decadence of the Persian court. The celebrity of the palace and its pleasures did not rule over her. But he goes further. It's not just a speculation. In what way was Sarah a precedent for Esther? They lived at completely different times. I mean, they both lived in antiquity, but there were about 1,000 years between them, roughly 1,000 years between them. Sarah lived most of, certainly the important years of her life, she lived in the land of Canaan. Esther lived in Persia. What did they have in common? Says Ksaf Sofer, actually, they had something important in common. Sarah was a precedent for Esther. And Ksav Sofer makes the following bold suggestion. I wouldn't say it. I wouldn't have thought of it. If I had thought of it, I wouldn't have said it. But Ksav Sofer does it. I want to share it with you. Ksav Sofer says that Sarah too was taken to the private chamber of kings, namely Pharaoh and Avimelech. Let's not forget that all of her years of marriage to Abraham had left Sarah childless. No doubt she craved the opportunity to conceive a child, which was not happening with Abraham, or at least to try. I'm not going to speculate as to why they were childless, whether Abraham couldn't play his part. But when she found herself in the private chamber of kings, the temptation to maybe give it a try. There would have been a temptation to take advantage of the close company of these royal paramours, yet she spurned them, and Hashem protected her from their advances. Similarly, although Sarah could not entirely escape the affections of Achashverosh, she approached him on her terms when the threat of genocide against the Jewish people compelled her to exploit, however reluctantly, her role as the queen of King Achashverosh. So as with Sarah, Esther exercised self-control and righteousness, and the 127 provinces of Persia did not rule over her. She ruled over them. I find this a compelling insight into the human condition and the challenge of self-control in the face of temptation. And I'd just like to end by saying, as Purim approaches, we have to bear in mind that even with the high-spirited celebrations, including eating and especially drinking, which are the order of the day, we must rule over Purim. Let Purim not rule over us. So have a wonderful Shabbos and an exuberant, joyous, spiritual Purim. And thank you to everyone for indulging my efforts to find something from Abarbanel on the festival of Purim. And I wish you a Freilichen Purim and a wonderful Shabbos.